Discover the true cost of white supremacy and how to combat it. White supremacy gained prominence after far-right organizations seized control of the U.S. Capitol in November 2020. The Proud Boys and other organizations become the public face of racism in the U.S. by parading about with Confederate flags. Truth be told, racism existed long before the Proud Boys and the Trump administration. Racism is deeply ingrained in American history, dating all the way back to the time of the country's formation by European colonists who established racial hierarchies to legitimize slavery and decades of racial prejudice. You'll discover from this book's summary how racism still affects all facets of American government and public life today. You'll learn how politicians deliberately incite racial animosity to persuade white people to cast ballots that are counter to their economic interests. You'll most critically get the ability to advocate for change. We can all profit from the solidarity dividend if white racism and inequality are effectively addressed. This audiobook will reveal everything in how Somali immigrants rescued a struggling industrial town in Maine, why public pools across the U.S. were filled with filth in the 1950s, and the connection between racism and climate change. The zero-sum paradigm has been conned into believing by white people. Think of a pail filled of crabs frantically attempting to find freedom. The crabs could readily scale the bucket walls if they crawled up each other's backs. But instead of moving in any direction, they keep bringing each other down in a flurry of thrashing pincers. Many people in modern-day America are in a similar state of plight as those crabs. Most Americans are stressed out as a result of their economic insecurity, deteriorating public infrastructure, and environmental concerns. And yet, the overwhelming majority of white Americans supported a blatantly anti-poor, anti-climate change candidate in the most recent election, who has already shown that he would make these issues worse. Why on earth would white people engage in such a way that is counter to their own interests? They do so because they think that black people's gains come at their expense. The main takeaway from this is that white people have been duped into thinking in terms of a zero-sum mindset. The political perspectives of white people are influenced by racial anger, according to psychologists Maureen Craig and Jennifer Richardson. They showed media articles about how racial minorities would become the majority by 2042 to respondents as part of a study. Conservative opinions on contentious political topics like raising the minimum wage or banning fossil fuels were considerably more likely to be adopted by people who see these shifting demographics as a danger to their own standing. Conservative politicians have long been aware of this mentality. They are skilled at inciting racial apprehension and hostility among their supporters. For instance, financing for benefits is presented as a form of handout for black people who are lazy and unwilling to work. Green energy legislation is presented as abandoning white miners. Fears that white people are being attacked are absurd from an objective standpoint. On average, white households are 13 times wealthier than black households. In terms of homeownership, white people outnumber black people, and they hold a disproportionate amount of high-status positions in government. Why then are they so worried about failing? To truly comprehend the zero-sum paradigm, one has to go all the way back to the European colonists who took Native Americans' lands and sold them into slavery in order to build the United States. They required a moral justification for their actions. They therefore created a hierarchy of races, with black people at the bottom. They were able to rationalize slavery thanks to this system, which helped build modern-day America. White folks actually benefited financially from black loss. White people are so fearful of equality because they believe that if it exists, the zero-sum paradigm will be reversed, and they would be the ones who lose out. But nothing could be further from the truth, as you'll find in the following chapter. Public services have consistently been damaged by racism. Imagine the scene: a sparkling public pool that formerly served as Montgomery, Alabama's pride and joy has been filled with filth so that no one can use it. The cause? The pool had to be desegregated and made available to everyone in the community, including African people, according to a 1959 court decision. Civil rights organizations were winning big victories in court battles around the nation that questioned the legitimacy of segregated public services. Yet officials decided to completely dismantle the public pool system rather than allowing for integrated public pools. Several swimming pools were rented out to exclusive clubs with a whites-only membership requirement. Due to a lack of investment, others were permitted to steadily decay. Some were completely shut down, like the pool in Montgomery. White people stopped funding public services when black people joined the public. The main takeaway from this is that racism has systematically weakened public services. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt unveiled the New Deal in response to the Great Depression. In accordance with this approach, the government provided inexpensive mortgages, improved job stability, and provided substantial social services to the underprivileged. Up to the 1950s, these government initiatives were backed by 70% of the white population. Yet there was a catch: black people were almost always excluded, whether by means of clear legislative provisions or sneaky practices like redlining. This is a reference to maps made in the 1930s that showed which regions banks thought were dangerous. Locations with a high concentration of black population were frequently designated as dangerous. This meant that the majority of black homeowners were not qualified for New Deal mortgages backed by the state. White middle-class growth was facilitated by New Deal measures. Nevertheless, everything changed when black people battled for a piece of the pie during the civil rights rallies of the 1960s. The percentage of white people who supported an activist government dropped to about 35%, where it is now. Why would white people abruptly reject government initiatives that had long benefited them? As a result of their concern for what may occur if black people got access to the same possibilities. Economic white privilege has existed for such a long time that it is totally undetectable. Instead than being the outcome of generous, and discriminating, public policies like the New Deal, white wealth now seems to be the product of a superior work ethic or bootstraps mindset. This economic inequality and the artificial racial hierarchy may be overturned if black people could benefit from the same public programs that white people did. White people drained the pools instead of swimming together, harming everyone. The American democracy is endangered by racism. Several pundits bemoaned the unprecedented assaults on American democracy as armed protesters besieged the U.S. Capitol to protest the results of the 2020 elections. These attacks, however, are not new. At its core, democracy is the notion that all citizens should have a voice in how their nation is managed by casting a ballot in elections. Nonetheless, this ideal has always been in danger. For a very long time, black people in the U.S. were not regarded as citizens. Additionally, today's racist voter suppression laws work to prevent hundreds of thousands of individuals from exercising their right to vote. The main takeaway is that racism undermines American democracy. The U.S. Constitution was created with the intention of giving the most power to affluent white men. Only white male landowners were allowed to vote in the first elections. States came up with inventive strategies to dissuade black votes even after the 15th Amendment made racial discrimination unlawful. For instance, Mississippi instituted poll taxes, which were $2, approximately equivalent to $57 today, every voter. Before allowing citizens to vote, they added additional restrictions including literacy tests and evaluations of good character. This effectively disenfranchised the majority of black people. But, it also excluded a large group of low-income white individuals who lacked the means to pay the poll taxes. These methods of voting suppression, which were used by numerous southern states, were the end of democracy. Compared to a national average of 69%, poll tax states had lower voter turnout by 1944, at only 18%. Regrettably, these methods of voter suppression are not just an interesting historical fact. In a different form, they still exist today. For instance, voter registration laws are complicated and vary from state to state, despite the fact that all voters must be registered. Legislators in conservative states like Texas have mandated that voters present certain photo IDs, specifying that college IDs are not acceptable in place of weapons permits. Given that 80% of gun owners are white, these rules are plainly discriminatory and intended to make voting for black people more difficult. Some states have begun to methodically deregister voters who didn't cast ballots in prior elections, including Ohio. Voting suppression legislation was created with black voters in mind, but conservative lawmakers have broadened their strategies to include young white voters as well. Why else would North Carolina have discontinued a system that registers high school kids without their consent? Or changed the location of the polling places so they weren't close to universities? The notion that everyone has a seat at the table is threatened by voter suppression, which is at odds with democracy itself. Racist animosity weakens unions and turns employees against one another. Workers at the Nissan automobile factory in Canton, Mississippi, had the chance to vote in 2017 on whether or not they wanted to become union members. Joining a union allowed them to advocate for greater healthcare and retirement benefits, higher pay, and a safer workplace as a group, which had significant potential advantages. And yet, by a margin of 500 votes, white workers chose not to form a union despite receiving all of these benefits for years. Why would these employees vote against what they believe in? Because they had been duped by a fairly dated trick. They had been misled into thinking that providing black employees with opportunities would harm them. The main takeaway from this is that racial animosity weakens unions and sets workers against one another. These apprehensions weren't entirely unwarranted. In fact, Nissan manufacturing managers made sure that white employees who followed orders received favors. For instance, white workers performed the cozier, safer tasks like checking cars before they left the factory floor while black laborers sweated over the hazardous assembly line. Equal rights advocacy would level the playing field. Yet it would also significantly raise everyone's wages and working conditions. So why, in exchange for a few benefits, were white employees willing to forfeit their chance at fundamentally better working conditions? Unions haven't always been so segregated based on race. The tremendous advancements we now take for granted, including the 40-hour workweek and retirement benefits, were really made possible by multiracial union effort. 1/3 of American workers joined to a union in the 1950s. However, this number started to decline in the early 1960s, and unions began to lose their negotiating position. This happened at the same time as the civil rights demonstrations in the 1960s, which some of the most influential unions supported. Black employees were portrayed as being protected by unions by politicians and business lobbyists who used racial politics to create discontent in the labor movement. Only 1 in every 16 American workers is a union member today. Another workers' movement offers optimism, even though the Canton example might make us very gloomy about the prospects for cross-racial organizing. Fast food employees from all throughout New York began to demonstrate in 2012 in support of greater pay, known as the Battle for 15. This movement bases its campaigns on racial harmony. Cities around the nation have voted to raise the minimum wage to $15 as a result of the remarkably successful campaign. Working together pays dividends in a meaningful way. Racism must be eradicated if climate change is to be defeated. We've all seen pictures of polar bears sitting on melting ice caps, wildfires destroying vast swaths of forest, and hurricanes pounding along the U.S. coasts. In order to sustain the massive fossil fuel industries, greedy businesses that bribe politicians are depicted as the main cause of climate change. Usually, we don't associate racism with a lack of political action on climate change. But we're overlooking a crucial aspect of the picture. The main takeaway from this is that racism must be opposed in order to combat climate change. The fact that white opposition to climate change initiatives grew after Obama was elected president is not a coincidence. Obama was accused by conservative politicians of being prepared to sacrifice white jobs, such as mining, in order to advance his environmental agenda. It turned back into a zero-sum game. With racial overtones, the environment versus the economic. In actuality, your race is a significant predictor of your willingness to combat global warming. According to opinion surveys, fewer than 25% of white respondents expressed concern about climate change, compared to 70% of black respondents. Climate change deniers were far more likely to be white people who exhibited racial hatred. The majority of the political and business figures who oppose action on climate change are affluent white men. Even if they do acknowledge the effects of global warming, their belief in the zero-sum game leads them to believe they can avert the consequences. That is accurate to some extent. Nearly all landfills and incinerators are located in black areas, or sacrifice zones. So, black people are disproportionately affected by the negative effects of pollution on their health. The fact is that we all share the same planet. The sacrifice zone cannot cleanly confine the toxins that permeate the soil and fill the sky. Both wealthy and poor towns are destroyed by hurricanes. There is no zero-sum game when it comes to climate change. There is loss everywhere. And multiracial organizing is the only way to stop it. Strong activist coalitions of all races, unified in their opposition to the fossil fuel business, are represented by initiatives like the Green New Deal. Native American leaders and a large number of individuals participated in and supported the protests at Standing Rock. These campaigns have gained so much traction precisely because these organizations have openly acknowledged how racial animosity contributes to climate change and have taken aggressive measures to combat it. All communities suffer from segregation. Your thoughts likely immediately turn to low-income communities full of people of color who are disenfranchised by the government and unable to access quality social services or educational opportunities when you think of racial segregated areas. The majority white suburbs with their expansive homes and well-kept yards may appear to be untouched by the effects of segregation. And it is true that white communities do not experience the same levels of police abuse and neglect as black communities. Yet, segregation has other expenses that also impact them. The main takeaway from this is that segregation harms all communities. Segregation is a deliberate practice in the United States. Throughout many years, it has undergone thorough design. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave American citizens free land that had been taken from Native American tribes. Naturally, black people were not eligible to become citizens. The wealth amassed from this region today benefits its almost 46 million white descendants. With discriminatory housing regulations and redlining, the Jim Crow laws that were in place starting in the late 19th century further reinforced this segregation. While openly barring black people from purchasing in white districts is now against the law, economic segregation is nevertheless maintained as a result of discriminatory zoning rules. They enable local governments to set minimum dwelling size requirements and prohibit the construction of apartment buildings. Due to the economic consequences of generations of discriminatory policies, most black buyers cannot afford white communities. The implications don't stop there, though. These regulations have made it difficult to build affordable homes and increased prices, leading to a severe housing crisis that affects all Americans in the lower and middle classes. Public schools are separated as a result of segregated suburbs. Children of color are not the only ones harmed by this. Children of all races experience isolation and cultural uniformity. According to studies, integrated schools help white students improve their critical thinking and problem-solving abilities. Also, they acquire the crucial skill of cultural competency. Learning to work with individuals who look different from you is an essential ability in a nation and world that are becoming more and more multicultural. Yet, it's an opportunity that isolated white people miss out on. In reality, 75% of white Americans say that they only get out with other white people. Neighborhoods that are integrated have virtually endless potential worth. Yet in order to do that, we must actively seek to dismantle a racist geography that has been in place for generations. To address centuries of institutional racism, we require focused solutions. People referred to the coronavirus pandemic as colorblind when it ravaged the United States in the early months of 2020. In fact, it appeared as though no one could escape the virus's grasp, whether they were wealthy or not, politicians or waitresses. But very quickly it became apparent that while the virus may not have cared about color when it came to who it infected, not all of its victims were suffering from it in the same way. In addition to performing hazardous frontline occupations, residing in areas with higher air pollution, and not having health insurance, Black and Latinx people were substantially more likely to die from the virus. The main takeaway from this is that systemic racism needs to be addressed with specific measures. Due to a long history of discriminatory, racist policies, people of color have perished in disproportionately high numbers. In the United States in the year 2020, life is like this. Although prejudice hurts everyone, individuals of color suffer the most. Cross-racial cooperation is crucial, but that doesn't mean that everyone should be treated equally. People of color who claim they don't notice race are genuinely blind to systemic racism's impacts. By openly addressing the impacts of racism and working to undo the harm that has been done, we can only work to create a strong, integrated society that benefits everyone. How can we achieve that? Adapt economic strategies to address racial inequality. Consider homeownership as an illustration. Because to redlining and other discriminatory tactics, black people still trail behind white homeowners in terms of property ownership. The wealth gap might be greatly reduced by leveling the playing field. Yet those color-blind mortgage tax advantages, which favor the wealthy already, won't be enough to achieve that. You need policies that specifically target inequality instead. For instance, rather than disregarding the deplorable redlining maps from the 1930s, you can utilize them as a reference to determine which places to prioritize when offering startup funding and affordable mortgages. These interventions are extremely unfair to white people, according to zero-sum thinking. Nevertheless, as we've seen, what helps the most oppressed also helps the rest of society. Together with significant social benefits, there are also significant economic advantages. A larger and more energized middle class would enable the economy to develop by up to $8 trillion by 2050 if the U.S. government specifically targeted inequality through initiatives like these. Integration and interracial organizing produce significant returns in terms of solidarity. In the 1990s, Lewiston, a small city in Maine, was on the verge of extinction. The city, which was once a humming industrial center, was left lifeless after firms shuttered and jobs were sent elsewhere. A vicious spiral was formed as more and more people fled in search of employment elsewhere. The majority of the storefronts on the main street soon became empty. This tragic tale has a pleasant conclusion. Lewiston is once again a prosperous city today. The industrial jobs never came back, but immigration has resulted in new business owners moving into the storefronts, which has led to the formation of new jobs and schools. The main takeaway from this is that racial organizing and integration lead to tremendous gains in solidarity. Lewiston is currently the home to thousands of immigrants from Somalia and other African nations. White Lewiston citizens would have been furious about this fact if they had subscribed to the zero-sum theory that declared black people's success can only come at their detriment. Yet, a lot of longtime inhabitants welcomed the newcomers. People from diverse backgrounds are meeting at events like the Unity Barbecue. The state's expansion of Medicare and changes to address the opioid crisis were fought for and won thanks to the mobilization of thousands of people by multiracial action groups. Residents of Lewiston have reaped the benefits of tremendous solidarity. This demonstrates that when black people succeed, white people do not suffer. In actuality, everyone will gain. The African immigrant, the black single mother, or the Hispanic worker harvesting your tomatoes are not the adversaries of economic advancement. The very small elite is the adversary because they are working together to degrade everyone's quality of life, whether they are black or white. These are the dishonest bureaucrats who pollute your air, the politicians who decide you shouldn't have access to quality healthcare, and the businesses that pay starving wages. The 1% of people who are currently affluent than the whole middle class. This elite minority has a vested interest in inciting racial animosity and dividing us. It understands the strength and consequent risk of interracial solidarity. But despite the constant stream of racist and anti-immigrant propaganda disseminated by outlets like Fox News, more and more people are becoming cynical. Multiracial coalitions are attempting to develop economic and environmental policies that benefit the majority rather than the minority. They are aiming to create a world filled with sparkling public pools that are accessible to all kids who wish to swim on a hot summer day. Economic policies intended to drain public funds and distribute wealth to the top 1%, a billionaire elite that is as wealthy as the whole middle class combined, are hurting tens of millions of Americans. However, white people still back politicians that put billionaires before them. Without a grasp of racial identity politics and how conservative politicians stoke the flames of racism for their own gain, we cannot comprehend this nonsensical conduct. All Americans may work together to challenge white supremacy and make their nation one of opportunity and prosperity.